Vera Thompson stood by the window of her modest apartment in the suburbs of Chicago, watching the rows of cars stretch out along the road. The day was gray, and the rain that had started to fall only highlighted her loneliness. She had been married to Jeff Thompson for 8 years. He was a simple working man, a welder at a factory. He wasn't particularly ambitious, but he was always hard-working and caring. Vera, on the other hand, worked in an office doing accounting, and while her job was boring, it provided for the family. Their life was quiet, without any major disturbances. They lived calmly, holding back all their desires and dreams. Vera loved her husband, but recently she had begun to feel that something was missing. Jeff was a good man, but his focus on family and long shifts at the factory had become routine for her, and she started to feel a pull toward something bigger, something exciting. One day, after work, her boss, Richard Holt, invited her on a weekend getaway. Richard was a tall, fit man in his 40s. He was successful, confident, and his words always carried authority. He was married, but Vera had long noticed an unspoken tension between them. Although she never allowed herself to think about him, his attention was flattering. He suggested a trip to a country house by a lake. It seemed like a good opportunity to get away from work and possibly meet his wife, about whom she knew very little. "You deserve a break, Vera," Richard said when he made the suggestion. "It'll be a good time to relax." Vera felt her heart skip a beat at the thought of spending a few days alone with her boss, but the thought of escaping her routine made her agree. Jeff, with his exhausting shifts, would be working the whole time, and she wouldn't see him for nearly a week. Richard's country house was located by a picturesque lake, a few hours' drive from the city. When Vera arrived there, she was greeted by warm air, green hills, and silence. She immediately felt the tension she had been carrying in her chest begin to lift. She had come there with the intention of simply relaxing, but her thoughts began to get tangled when she saw how thoughtfully Richard had prepared the house. Everything was carefully arranged, from the soft chairs in the cozy living room to the beautiful views from the terrace. In the evening, they sat by the fireplace. He poured her some wine, and they began talking. "You've always worked so hard, Vera," he said, studying her face with interest. "Why don't you allow yourself to relax a little?" She smiled nervously. "I'm used to being independent, Rich. It's not easy for me to let go of my responsibilities." "I understand," he replied, but there was something deeper in his eyes. Vera felt as if his gaze was directed not just at her, but through her. They talked for a long time, and Vera, gradually relaxing, began to feel that Richard had become her support. His words soothed her, and something inside her, something that had long been suppressed, responded. Later, on the misty morning of the next day, when they were rowing on the lake, she suddenly felt Richard pull her towards him. It was unexpected and exciting. Vera knew that this couldn't go on. But at that moment, when their lips met, she felt as though she had lost control of the situation. After that day, Vera became someone she hadn't been before. Her soul was filled with guilt, but at the same time, it was an unfamiliar freedom. Richard had become her constant companion during the weekend. Every moment spent with him was vibrant, thrilling, full of new energy. Vera realized that she had betrayed her husband. She couldn't stop thinking about what Jeff would say if he found out about her infidelity. She remembered how they once dreamed of their life together, how they held hands, looking at each other with love, and now her heart was torn between her husband and the new, bright world Richard had shown her. However, Richard wasn't someone who simply wanted a romantic fling. He continued to show Vera how much he liked her. She began to see in him a man who was not only successful and experienced, but also passionate, making her feel more alive than she had ever felt. "You don't have to make a decision right now, Vera. Just live in the moment," Richard said when they found themselves alone again. These were the words that made her doubt herself. She wasn't the woman who stayed at home trying to be a good wife anymore. She was starting to realize that perhaps she would never be the one who was truly content in her marriage. Vera returned to Chicago a few days later, but she was no longer the woman who had left. She felt that her life had changed dramatically. Jeff, despite all his shortcomings, was her husband, and though she felt grateful for his care and loyalty, guilt still clung to her. One evening, when she returned from work, Jeff was home. He looked tired, but he was happy to see her. "How was your weekend?" he asked, looking at her with interest. Vera fell silent, unsure of how to respond. She could have said everything was great, but guilt stopped her. "It was fine," she replied, trying to appear casual. However, the internal discomfort wouldn't leave her. Richard had been sending her messages, but she responded with restraint, knowing that she had to return to her usual life. A few weeks passed, and Vera began to feel the pressure weighing on her again. Deep down, she knew that she had to make a choice, and it wasn't going to be easy. Richard was still a part of her life, but her love for Jeff hadn't disappeared. Her relationship with her husband wasn't perfect, but she felt that if she betrayed him completely, she would lose herself. And so one evening, when Jeff sat down to dinner, Vera took the plunge. "I need to tell you something," she said, a little nervously. "What about, Vera?" he asked, unaware of what was coming. "I was with another man," she admitted, her eyes cast downward. Jeff froze. His face changed. He was stunned. "Why?" he asked quietly. She was silent for a long moment, unsure of how to answer. But in her voice there were no excuses. She realized that only honesty could save their relationship. "I was confused, Jeff. I didn't know what to do, but now I understand that I've lost so much. I want us to try to get back what we had." He was silent, then said, looking directly into her eyes, "We have to try, Vera. But I need time to figure out if I can forgive you." Vera and Jeff went through a difficult period, but over time, they found a way to rebuild their trust in each other. Vera understood that sometimes life gives you difficult tests, but it's important to learn lessons and move forward. Time passed, and although their life wasn't perfect, it became more conscious. Jeff began to help her around the house, and Vera started to appreciate every morning they spent together. They tried to build a future together, and though there were still challenges ahead, they had become a team again. Meanwhile, Richard faded from her life. He no longer sent messages or tried to meet. She realized that this was the goodbye they both deserved. He wasn't the person with whom she could build a future, no matter how dear he had been to her at that moment. A few more weeks went by, and Vera felt her world slowly changing. She and Jeff were working on rebuilding their trust. It wasn't easy. There were many unspoken emotions, unclear feelings, and old grievances that kept resurfacing. Their relationship became different. They started talking to each other more than ever before. Every day felt like a new step, and though Vera felt it wasn't yet perfect, she started to believe that they could find happiness together. But Richard had not left her life. His messages continued to come, though less frequently than before. He tried to be cautious, but his presence remained like a shadow, always nearby but never crossing the line. Vera increasingly found herself lost in her feelings. She couldn't choose between the past and the future, between what she had with Jeff and what might have been with Richard. But one thing was clear. She couldn't keep them both in her life the way it had been. One evening, when Jeff went to work, Vera finally decided to meet with Richard. He had suggested they meet at the cafe where they had spent hours talking about life, dreams, and doubts. This place had become symbolic for her, a bridge between her past and present. As difficult as it was, she had to find an answer to all her questions. When she walked into the cafe, Richard was sitting by the window. He looked as he always did, confident, but there was something anxious in his eyes. "You came," he said when she approached. "I need to talk to you, Richard," Vera replied, sitting down across from him. He watched her carefully, understanding that this was an important moment. "What have you decided?" he asked, trying to hide the tension in his voice. She sighed, mentally gathering her thoughts, carefully choosing her words. "I can't continue this, Richard. I can't live two lives. I have to be honest. With you and with myself. I was confused. But now I understand that I can't choose between the past and the future. It's wrong." Richard sat silently. His face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed his emotions. He knew that this meeting would be a turning point, and he understood that she had made her choice. "You made the right decision, Vera," he said after a pause, his voice softening. "You deserve to be happy, but you also deserve happiness that's real. And if you're not ready to be with me, I'll let you go. You've been an important part of my life, and I will always remember you." Vera felt her heart tighten. She was grateful to Richard for his understanding, for not trying to manipulate her decisions. It was hard, but she knew she had made the right step. There had to be room in her life for only one person: Jeff. Returning home, Vera felt the air in the apartment lighter. She realized that now, with her decision made, she needed to focus on her life with Jeff. He was still working, still coming home tired and silent, but their relationship was a little different now. They had learned to talk to each other more, to share their feelings and emotions. Some time passed, and though their life was not perfect, it became more conscious. Jeff began helping her around the house, and Vera began to appreciate every morning they spent together. They tried to build a future together, and although challenges remained, they became a team again. When Vera stood on the terrace of their new home, looking at the rising sun, she felt that she had finally returned home. This journey had been long and difficult, but she realized that, in the end, everything that had happened had been a part of her path. She had grown as a person, and now she knew that she could build her life on honesty and love. Jeff came up behind her and hugged her, and though there were still some unsaid things between them, they both knew that their future was in their hands. "We'll make it, Vera," he said, holding her close. She nodded and looked him in the eyes. This moment was theirs. Everything else could wait. Time passed. Vera and Jeff learned to be with each other, and though their relationship had changed, it had grown stronger. Vera was no longer the woman who sought to immortalize her mistakes in the past. She realized that love and trust were a long process that required effort and patience. With each day, they became more understanding of each other. Vera realized that the most important things in life were not striving for perfection, but the ability to build a future based on honesty and respect. And though she would never return to what had been with Richard, the lessons she learned became a part of her life. They continued moving forward, building their life on the ruins that had once been destroyed. But it was that very destruction that allowed them to find a new path, one full of love and understanding. Vera didn't know what would come next. She understood that her past and future were now intertwined, and although she couldn't exactly predict what time would bring, she knew she was ready to walk this path with Jeff, honestly, without false hopes, and fully aware that everything they had was built on the fact that they were ready to work together, despite all the difficulties.